Okay, so we're diving into something a bit different today. Usually we're poring over some dense political commentary or economic analysis, but you sent me something, well, let's just say a bit more fun.
Yeah, a little lighter, but still packed with data. Just how we like it.
Exactly. It's this predictive analysis, right, for the Arsenal versus Brentford match. Football, soccer, whatever you want to call it.
Right, the beautiful game. And this isn't just some pundit's hot take. This is a full-on match summary report from, get this, the Gambler's Ruin Project.
Yeah.
They've apparently used some pretty serious statistical models to try and predict the outcome.
The Gambler's Ruin Project, huh? Well, the name's certainly catchy.
Definitely grabs your attention.
So, for our listeners who maybe haven't spent their weekend knee-deep in regression analysis,
Which, let's be honest, is probably most of us.
yeah, probably a good call. What we're going to do today is unpack this report, try and cut through the data jargon and get to the good stuff. What are the actual chances of each team winning? How confident are these models in their predictions? Any insights into the possible score line? And, the question on everyone's mind.
Is there a smart bet to be made?
Exactly. Plus, we'll touch on some of the important informational bits and responsible gambling stuff included in the report. Gotta keep it real.
Always. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. We've got these predicted probabilities, those confidence intervals, even a Monte Carlo simulation thrown in for good measure. It's a pretty comprehensive analysis.
Okay, well, let's not waste any more time. The big question right off the bat, who does the data favor in this match? Arsenal or Brentford? Where did these fancy models land?
Well, the report kicks off with what they call a stacked model. And according to this model, Arsenal is the favorite. They've got a 53.97% chance of winning. Brentford's sitting at 22.03%, with a draw probability of 24%. So, not a landslide. But Arsenal's got the edge, according to this initial analysis.
53.97%. So slight favorite then. Not exactly a sure thing.
Right, exactly. And that's where these confidence intervals they talk about come in. I mean, it's one thing to have a single number, but how sure are we that that number is actually accurate?
Yeah, what are those exactly? Confidence intervals. Break it down for us.
So think of a confidence interval as a range, right? It basically says, look, we think the true probability of this thing happening is somewhere within this range. So for Arsenal, even though the model spits out a 53.97% win probability, the confidence interval is actually quite wide. They're saying the actual likelihood of an Arsenal win could be anywhere between 67.73% and 80.21%.
Okay, so even though they're the favorite, there's still a good chunk of uncertainty there.
Exactly. Now for the draw, the interval is much narrower, from 9.07% to 18.93%. And for Brentford, it's 7.41% to 16.66%. So the model's a bit more sure about those probabilities. The wider the interval, the less certain the model is.
That makes sense. So it's not just about the initial prediction, it's also about how much we can trust that prediction. Now, I'm sure some of our listeners, myself included, might be thinking, okay, Arsenal favored, maybe I should put a few quid on them. But the report has a very clear betting recommendation. And it's
No bet recommended. Pretty blunt.
yeah, no messing around there. And they even mention an implied win probability for Arsenal of like 74% somewhere else in the report. So if they're so likely to win, why shouldn't we bet on them?
Well, here's the thing, right? It all comes down to value. Even if a team is very likely to win, if the odds offered by the bookmakers don't reflect that probability accurately, the bet just doesn't make financial sense. You're not getting enough bang for your buck, so to speak.
So it's not enough to just know who's likely to win. You also have to consider what you stand to gain versus what you risk losing.
Exactly. And the report even mentions this thing called the Kelly criterion, which is this, well, it's a bit complicated, but basically a strategy for figuring out how much you should bet based on your perceived edge and the odds being offered. And in this case, it seems like the Kelly criterion is saying, nope, even with Arsenal's high win probability, the odds just aren't juicy enough to justify a bet.
So the potential reward doesn't outweigh the risk. Okay, that's good to know before I go putting my life savings on the line.
Probably a wise move.
Now, I'm seeing something here about a Monte Carlo simulation. That sounds pretty high tech. What's that all about? And does it agree with the stacked model?
Yeah, so a Monte Carlo simulation is a bit different. Instead of just calculating probabilities based on statistics, it basically runs a ton of simulated matches, like thousands, maybe even millions of them, based on the underlying probabilities of different events happening. So it's kind of like playing out the match a bunch of times in a computer to see what happens.
Interesting. So it's almost like a virtual experiment, right?
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting is that the results from this simulation are actually a bit different from the stacked model. The Monte Carlo simulation gives Arsenal a 43.34% chance of winning, which is, significantly lower than the 53.97% from the stacked model.
Oh, so they don't fully agree then.
Not quite. The Monte Carlo simulation also shows a much higher probability of a draw at 34.23% compared to the stacked model's 24%. Brentford's win probability is pretty similar in both models, hovering around 22%.
Huh. Okay. So why the difference? Why would these two models produce such different results?
Well, it could be that the Monte Carlo simulation, because it runs so many trials, is better at capturing the inherent randomness of a single football match. Anything can happen on the day. Maybe that's why the draw probability is higher in the simulation.
So maybe it's not about saying one model is right and the other is wrong, but more about understanding how they approach the problem differently and what we can learn from those differences.
Right, it's like getting a second opinion. It gives you a more complete picture.
Okay, well, all this talk about probabilities and simulations is great, but let's get down to brass tacks. What about the actual score line? Does the report give us any insight into what the final score might be?
It does. They use something called a Poisson prediction to figure out the most likely score lines. Basically, the Poisson distribution is this statistical tool that's often used in, football predictions to estimate the probability of a team scoring a certain number of goals. It looks at a team's average scoring rate and, their average conceding rate to make these predictions.
Okay, so it's taking into account both how good a team is at scoring and how leaky their defense might be.
Exactly. And according to this Poisson prediction, the most likely final score is Arsenal 20 Brentford. They give that a 19.2% probability. Next up is Arsenal 3 at 15.5%, and then Arsenal 2-1 at 13.7%. So those are the top three.
So a comfortable Arsenal win seems to be the most likely scenario.
Yeah, that's what the Poisson model is suggesting. But it's not ruling out other possibilities. For example, the most likely draw is a 1-1 draw with a 9.8% probability. And rounding out the top five most likely score lines, we've got Arsenal 1-0 at 8.5%. So, there's still a chance of a tight match or even a draw.
Right. Nothing's guaranteed in football, that's for sure. Now, we've talked a lot about these models, but how do we know if they're any good? I mean, are these just random numbers, or do these models actually have a track record of making accurate predictions?
That's a great question, and the report actually addresses that. They have a section on model performance where they talk about something called cross-validation accuracies.
Okay, cross-validation accuracies. Help me out here. What does that mean exactly?
So cross-validation is essentially a way to test how well a predictive model is likely to perform on new data that it hasn't seen before. So it's like giving the model a practice test. They take some of the existing data, hide it from the model, and then see if the model can predict those hidden outcomes accurately.
So it's a way to see if the model can actually generalize its knowledge and make predictions about new matches, not just the ones it's already been trained on.
Exactly. And the report gives us the average accuracies for 5 different models they used. The random forest model has an accuracy of 56.32%, the bagging ensemble, 55.79%, neural network, 55.26%, XGBoost, 54.21%, and finally the Bayesian classifier, 53.68%.
Okay, those numbers, they're in the mid-50s, which isn't exactly stellar, is it?
Right. It's important to point out that those accuracies aren't super high. It means that these models are getting it right a little more than half the time.
Which means they're getting it wrong almost half the time.
Yeah. And that just goes to show how hard it is to predict football matches, right? There's so many variables, so many unpredictable factors that can influence the outcome. But at least these figures give us some context, some idea of how reliable these models have been in the past.
So we should take these predictions with a grain of salt. They're interesting, they give us some insight, but they're not gospel.
Exactly. They're tools to help us understand the probabilities, not crystal balls.
All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground here. To help wrap things up, the report has a handy little section called Final Verdict. What are the key takeaways from that?
Okay, so the final verdict basically boils it all down. They say heavy favorite, Arsenal.
Mm-hmm.
Though, to be fair, based on that initial stacked model, maybe slight favorite would be more accurate.
Right. Not a huge difference in win probability.
Exactly. They also say low chance of draw or upset. Although, remember that Monte Carlo simulation did give a higher probability to a draw. Importantly, they reiterate that there's no betting opportunity advised because the odds just aren't favorable. And finally, they highlight the most likely final score as Arsenal 20 Brentford, which comes from that Poisson prediction we talked about earlier. So the big picture is, yeah, Arsenal's probably going to win, but it's not a slam dunk, and betting on it might not be the smartest move.
Okay, great. Now, before we wrap up completely, you sent over some additional information from the Gambler's Ruin Project, some stuff from their closing remarks, disclaimer, and legal notice. Anything important we should highlight there?
Yeah, definitely. This is important context. Their closing remarks make it very clear that all this stuff we've been talking about, it's for informational purposes only. And that all these predictions, they're AI generated.
So they're saying, hey, these are just statistical estimates. Don't go betting your house on them.
Precisely. And they also have a really important message about responsible gambling. They stress that gambling can be addictive, so please bet responsibly. And they even provide helpline information for anyone who might be struggling with gambling-related issues.
Yeah, that's crucial. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement, but it's important to remember that gambling can have serious consequences if it's not done responsibly.
Absolutely. So for our listeners in North America, the National Problem Gambling Helpline number is 1-800-522-4700. And it's available 24/7. For those in the UK, the resource is Be Gamble Aware, and you can reach them at 0808 AG20 133, or find more information on their website, begambleaware.org.
It's great that they're providing those resources. Hopefully it'll help anyone who needs it.
Yeah, absolutely. And they also have this really clear message about, betting smart, betting safe, and keeping things fun and balanced. It's all about remembering that gambling should be a form of entertainment, not a way to make money or solve problems.
Right, a healthy perspective. And what about the disclaimer? Anything noteworthy there?
Yeah, the disclaimer is really clear that these predictions, they don't guarantee outcomes, and they shouldn't be considered financial or betting advice. And they, again, remind everyone about the potential for addiction and advise people to only wager what they can afford to lose and to seek help if needed. It's a responsible approach.
Okay, sounds like they're covering all their bases. And lastly, the legal notice.
Right, so the legal notice basically says that none of this constitutes an offer to participate in gambling. And they state very clearly that the Gambler's Ruin Project does not operate as a bookmaker or betting service and does not encourage gambling. So they're clearly defining their role as analysts, not bickies. And lastly, they remind everyone that it's their own responsibility to make sure they're complying with all the local laws about sports betting wherever they are.
So, to sum it all up, our deep dive into this report from the Gambler's Ruin Project suggests that while the data points to Arsenal as the favorite in their match against Brentford, the current betting odds don't offer good value, so no betting is recommended. We also saw how different models can produce different results, like with the draw probability. The most likely scoreline, according to their analysis, is a 2-0 win for Arsenal. And importantly, the Gambler's Ruin Project really emphasizes that this is all just for information, and they provide a lot of resources and reminders about responsible gambling.
Absolutely. A great summary.
And you know what I find really fascinating about all this? When you look at those subtle differences in the predictions from the different statistical models, like how the stacked model and the Monte Carlo simulation disagreed on the draw probability, it really highlights how much uncertainty there is in trying to predict the future, even in something as seemingly quantifiable as a football match.
Yeah.
It makes you think, right, even with all these fancy algorithms and data, we can't know for sure what's going to happen.
It's a humbling reminder that even the most sophisticated tools have their limitations.
Yeah, and maybe it's not just about trying to find the one right answer, but more about appreciating the range of possibilities and embracing the uncertainty that comes with any prediction.
Well said. It's about the journey, not just the destination.